tape recording. Going. Look at that. I said tape recording. How old am I? Frightening. I never did reel to reel, but I do know what a cassette tape is. So, we're going to start off with a little quiz. A tux. What's a tuxedo? A dress suit? Right? What distinguishes it? What makes it? Well, because I wear suits all the time, but I'm pretty sure I don't wear a tux all the time.
The collar has a satin.
You have the sort of the edging, right? The edging is all the little edging, something like that.
It's more ornate.
It's more ornate. So you mean you have to have one of those 1970s giant fluffy shirts and the giant wing collars,
Well, it's
crushed velvet.
There's such a variety of tuxedos today.
But they're more ornate than a regular suit.
Yes, yes.
So if I wore like a double-breasted, bright neon polyester suit,
No.
would that count as a tux? But that's ornate.
That's right.
No? Or maybe?
No, it's usually a dark color.
Usually dark.
Nowadays, not true.
But I've seen varieties in tux shops that it's in a tux shop, so I'm kind of assuming it counts as a tuxedo. But I wouldn't call it dark.
Yes, always has something, either a bow tie or some other kind of tie that's not a long tie.
Okay, not long tie. All right.
Used to be a bow tie, but
Often a bow tie, but you can also have the cravat kind of
they
thing.
have everything today.
They have every. So is there such a thing as a tuxedo, or is it just whatever you want to wear?
No, you gotta ask the woman you're going with. She will tell you exactly what to wear.
You've got to ask the woman you're going with. Going where?
Where, the wedding, the prom, it is a special occasion.
So if you're going to a wedding or a prom, then you're wearing a tux. And if,
We would wear it to the office.
so is a tux defined by the actual accoutrement and the style, or is it defined by the destination?
Yes.
Which is it?
Occasion.
I mean, if I wear a bow tie and a nice black suit to a wedding, does that count as a tux? If I wear a bright yellow-green velvety with satin trimming and a cummerbund and a bow tie to a wedding, does that count as a tux?
You make a good conversation piece.
I make a good conversation. I give people something to laugh at.
Yes.
Look what that guy wore. Is that a tux? Does that count as a tux? If I wear the dark black suit, a nice material, nice cut, nice bow tie, a tuxedo shirt, with the little vented slat type things, and a cummerbund, but it was just a black suit, didn't have the edging or anything like that. Do you think people would be is that a tux?
I don't think so.
It also depends, if
Everything
you're the
goes.
groom at the wedding, he couldn't get dressed up, but if you're a guest,
Mhm.
it will be different. So that would also depend on your role in this event at the destination.
So maybe it's not just the destination, maybe it's actually the rule I have in the destination. That if it says cocktail attire and it's a wedding, then the groom is going to be wearing something for the cocktail attire that is undeniably a tux by the classical definition, unless they're a very unclassical kind of person. But someone else might be wearing cocktail attire, which is not quite tuxedo, even though that used to be the definition of cocktail attire. They might be still wearing something much nicer than they would wear to the office or to the shul. Does that make sense? Maybe. So what I'm trying to tease out here is that sometimes our ability to define something can be based upon its own features, it can be based upon where it's used, or it can be based upon how it's used or the role of the person that's using it. And I want you to keep this in mind as we dive into this week's Torah portion of Tetzaveh, because the main part that we're going to be looking at today are the spiffy clothes of the Kohen Gadol, the things that the Kohen wears. Now, you started us off with this great word over here, and I don't know whether the camera picked it up, vestments, right? Isn't that a wonderful word? The Hebrew word that's used is bigadim. Now, I guarantee you if you were to look into a modern Hebrew-English dictionary, and you were to look up the word begadim, because you were at Sears and you wanted to ask somebody where to find the begadim and you wanted to use the English for it, you would probably use the word
Clothing.
clothes. Clothing.
Clothing.
Translations love to show off their great vocabulary. That's how they became good translators, because they love languages. And when they know the clothes are important, they call them vestments. And when they know the clothes are not important, they call them clothes when they translate. And you can go through most translations and that will happen. It'll talk about someone wearing clothes, and it'll talk about the priests wearing vestments, and if you look in the Hebrew, it's the same word. So we're going to generally try to use the word clothes in our conversation. If you really feel you have to say vestment, that's up to you. And I'm going to adjust the air conditioning.
Please.
Because I'm realizing it's a little warmer in here than I'm comfortable with.
All right.
Close the door.
And I
We're
think
not
we
getting
can...
8 inches of snow anytime soon.
Yeah, as it's- Since it's 80-some degrees outside, it's important to make it a little bit cooler inside. Okay, so let's go ahead and get underway. So hopefully everyone has a Chumash. We are going to start on page 504 of the Eitz Chaim, and we're starting in chapter 28 of the book of Exodus. Not quite the beginning, but pretty close to our parasha. Page 504, chapter 28, verse 1. Volunteer.
You mean as in you shall bring forth?
That's the one.
Okay.
That's the one. Okay.
You shall bring forward your brother Aaron with his sons from among the Israelites to serve me as priests. Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, Eleazar and Itamar, the sons of Aaron. Make sacred vestments for your brother Aaron, for dignity and adornment. Next, you shall instruct all who are skillful, whom I have endowed with the gift of skill, to make Aaron's vestments, for consecrating him to serve me as priest. These are the vestments they are to make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a fringed tunic, a headdress, and a sash. They shall make those sacred vestments for your brother Aaron and his sons for priestly service to me. They therefore shall receive the gold, the blue, purple, and crimson yarn, and the finest linen.
All right, now where do the fine linen and all these yarns come from? Last week's Torah portion. When we were talking in Truma about all the things that were being donated, all those things that were being donated are now being doled out to the skilled workers for weaving and for producing these items. So first it was taken in, and now we're seeing it get put to use. Make sense? Make sure we have that. And what are we making here? What are the clothes?
Vestments.
Vestments. Vestments. It's just,
The priest clothes.
we got a tunic, we got a breastplate, we've got an over apron at the ephod, we've got a sash that goes around, we've got a headpiece that's coming, right? So it's, well,
Rather elaborate.
it's rather elaborate, but I mean, didn't most people wear tunics? And if you got a tunic, wouldn't you have something around your waist? And if you're doing work, like, I don't know, slaughtering animals, wouldn't you probably have some sort of outer apron around it? So why do they need to make special? I mean, he's probably got this stuff in his closet, except for the breastplate.
They forgot the pants.
What's that?
They forgot the pants.
They forgot the pants. But we get to some breeches later. But
From
They're not part of
Scotland.
the sacred vestment.
no, but we do talk about those leggings a little bit later. But what I want to try and point out here is that although these are certainly being made fancy, the actual items of clothes themselves, again, apart from the breastplate or the headpiece later, are not that exceptional at all. These are the kind of things that most people would have. Not of the same quality, certainly not made from the same fine materials. But other people were wearing clothes too. They weren't naked. It's not like nowadays where if you said, the rabbi needs a tunic, the rabbi doesn't have a tunic in his closet, because unless you need a tunic, you don't own a tunic. Everyone would have been wearing tunics of some variety. Everyone would have had sashes of some sort. And for different types of work, many people would have had aprons or outer coverings at some time. So what makes these sacred?
The material of which they are made. Because if you walked among people, you would immediately recognize who the priest was by the way he was dressed, with maybe a tunic, but it's going to be gorgeous, blue and purple and crimson, so you'll be able to identify him separately from the rest of the people.
So it's holy, you actually said two different things, but layered them together, so let me just pull them apart so we can discuss them each. One was because of the materials in general, so it could just be, it's holy because it's made of holy stuff, right? If it's holy stuff, it's holy.
Holy in the sense of set apart.
Okay, or you said it was holy because of its beauty, because it sets apart the Kohen Gadol. Therefore, it is holy because of its beauty, its grandeur, its glory. I mean, it says, as we just saw right there. Let me just get our verse here. There we are in verse 2. Make sacred vestments for your brother Aaron for dignity and adornment. Lechavod ultifaret. Right? For honor and for glory and beauty. Okay, so it's the beauty that makes them holy. And if they were shmatas, they wouldn't be holy then, right?
I don't think so. I think the reason why Jews love Givenchy is because they really have something about designers.
We love what?
Givenchy. Givenchy.
Okay.
We love designers, and this is the designers.
The ultimate tailor? Who's your tailor? God. So you're saying it's the design.
It's holy because God is the designer.
Ah, okay. So it's not holy because of what it's made from, and it's not holy because it's especially pretty. It's holy because the designer is holy, meaning God, as the ultimate designer, as opposed to the workers who are putting it together. Since God designed
They're
it.
chosen by God. It's not
Correct.
anybody who can design the clothing.
Or who can create the clothing,
for the
right.
priests.
So the designer and his ability to have it constructed, meaning God's manner in making this all happen, the collection, the beauty that's in it, that under God's supervision makes it holy. But if someone else in another culture, in another country, or another time had created an identical set of clothing and was selling it, off the rack, we wouldn't call it holy then? There's nothing intrinsic to the clothes themselves that make them holy? It's only because of whose name is on the label? Made by God. Now it's holy. Made by Levi. Now it's not holy, even if it's identical. We're saying knockoffs wouldn't be holy.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Okay. Let's see a little bit more detail about this then.
They shall make the ephod of gold, of blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and of fine twisted linen worked into designs. It shall have 2 shoulder pieces attached. They shall be attached at its 2 ends. And the decorated band that is upon it shall be made like it of one piece with it, of gold, of blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and of fine twisted linen. Then take 2 lazuli stones and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel, 6 of their names on the one stone, and the names of the remaining 6 on the other stone, in the order of their birth. On the 2 stones you shall make seal engravings, the work of a lapidary, of the names of the sons of Israel. Having bordered them with frames of gold, attach the 2 stones to the shoulder pieces of the ephod as stones for remembrance of the Israelite people, whose names Aaron shall carry upon his 2 shoulder pieces for remembrance before the Lord.
All right, so we got a little more detail here. It's not apparently just a tunic and an apron. We've got special shoulder pieces that are going along with this. This is not the 1980s shoulder pads, but a little bit something different. We've got special stones that have been engraved with the names of the tribes. 6 on each shoulder. Make sense? Now, most of us probably famously know about the famous Choshen Mishpat, the breastplate, but the Kohen Gadol had the names of the tribes on the shoulders as well. Why? What's that? Because he was told to. Because God's your designer, and if God says it looks good with them on the shoulders, you wear them on the shoulders. You don't question the designer. Get out on the runway and do your thing. Twirl at the end, slaughter the ox, come back in,
It's like he was carrying the tribes in before God.
Right. Most commentators see this as being a rather clear symbolism that the Kohen Gadol was carrying the nation of Israel. He was carrying all of the tribes on his shoulders. Just as we would say, the weight of the world is on so-and-so's shoulders. Well, the weight of all of the tribes of Israel was on the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol. Make sense? Okay. Not just a decorative piece. A little bit more?
Then make frames of gold and 2 chains of pure gold. Braid these like corded work and fasten the corded chains to the frames. You shall make a breastpiece of decision, worked into a design. Make it in the style of the ephod. Make it of gold, of blue, of purple, and crimson yarns, and fine twisted linen. It shall be square and doubled, a span in length and a span in width.
All right, let me just point out here, because we also have breastplates on many Torahs and many synagogues, which are usually made out of silver, we have an assumption that the Choshen Mishpat of the Kohen Gadol, the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, was also a large metal piece. Similarly, in Middle Ages, when we talked about breastplates that knights wore, we always thought about metal, and we think about metal. What was it made from? Gold cloth. When it says gold here, it's a color and probably a material as well that was stretched out until it was a thread. But it's gold and blue, purple, and crimson yarn. The fabric itself was made out of yarn and woven gold, not made out of a plate that was attached to the chest of the Kohen. So it wasn't a big metal box on his chest. It was a soft, pliant, fabric-y type of thing that's going to have some mountings on it. Any questions on that? I thought I saw a little...
Not a question, but a comment.
Mm-hmm.
These are very specific directions. This leaves nothing to chance. And yet, he told you to pick people to do this who are really, really skilled.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't want them to put their own visions or artistry into it. Nothing of theirs, no matter what, if they're going to follow these directions, I don't care how imaginative they are, they're not to do that. This is exactly braided, 2 of them, this way, that way.
I'm sure, Paula, what were those names you mentioned of designers?
Yeah,
Givenchy.
I'm sure that Givenchy doesn't sit at the sewing machine himself, herself, thank you. Whew, yeah, you can tell I'm out of my depth there. Doesn't sit at the sewing machine herself for everything that carries her label, or that goes in her fashion shows.
His women are having a great time with this.
I'm sure that the great designers of the world, well, let's make it a little generic. I'm sure that the great designers of the world do not sit at the sewing machines, him or herself, and sew every last stitch, but give instructions to the perhaps even more talented seamstresses and tailors, because the great designer may not be the greatest sewer, right? You can be a wonderful architect, that doesn't mean you're a great bricklayer. And similarly, God may be so specific here because he knows that he can't sew it. He tried his hand at sewing once. Adam and Eve, right? He gave them clothes after they left the garden, and he hasn't done anything since. So clearly God knew that sewing wasn't his thing, and instead he gave very specific instructions to make sure that people who were better sewers would be able to handle it. Some visual of God at the sewing machine. It doesn't work. Doesn't work. Okay.
Is this comparable to the great priests in Egypt? Did they also have symbolism on, the high priest on their?
Every culture around the world that has anything like a religious ceremony that involves people who are central to that ceremony requires special clothes for the ceremony. Whether it be a coming of age ceremony, whether it be a priest that serves regularly, whether it be a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence in the religious pageantry of the culture, clothes always figure into it. No one just shows up wearing what they wore the day before for ceremonies. They're always dressed in something that is distinct, something special. How special, how precise, that varies from culture to culture. But yes, Egypt did have their own variation on priestly dress. And there were some similarities and a lot of differences.
So this wasn't necessarily surprising to the Israelites that they were used to
Seeing
high
priests
priests that are
wearing special things.
very strange things.
Exactly. Things that were often on a template of the normal, but also very special. And certainly the breastplate here was more elaborate and distinct from the average person's clothing, as we're going to finish up the paragraph and find out what it was mounted on it.
Okay. Set in it mounted stones in 4 rows of stones. The first row shall be a row of carnelians, chrysolite, and emerald. The second row, a turquoise, a sapphire, and an amethyst. The third row, a jacinth, an agate, and a crystal. And the fourth row, a beryl, a lapis lazuli, and a jasper. They shall be framed with gold in their mountings. The stones shall correspond in number to the names of the sons of Israel, 12. Corresponding to their names, they shall be engraved like seals, each with its name for the 12 tribes.
When we say engraved like seals, it means that the names will be cut into it the same way you cut into a seal that you would push into clay to make an imprint. Right? Not seal like sea lion. Okay. Okay. So this is a rather odd thing to be wearing. I think we can probably agree that it's meant to represent our big squirrels. It's the gentleman from the heating and air conditioning company is checking through some of the equipment, and apparently he has a heavy tread. He might drop in, exactly. But remember, we don't have to build roofs here that can hold up a lot of snow. So.
That's right. Marty would get very upset if he dropped it.
Harvey would get upset. I'd get upset. So we have this rather unusual Choshen Mishpat, which is only going to be worn by the Kohen Gadol, and no one else wears it. So is that then what makes him the Kohen Gadol? Because he's wearing this. No one else is going to wear this. No one else is going to wear as elaborate of clothing as him. Is that what makes him the Kohen Gadol? No?
No.
Okay, well what makes him the Kohen Gadol then?
Whatever God decides.
Whatever God decides. But who?
The anointing.
The anointing? Well, we just saw at the very beginning that Moses, although he's not mentioned by name in this entire parasha, will be appointing his brother Aaron to be the first Kohen Gadol. But Aaron's got more than one son. Who's going to be the next Kohen Gadol?
The eldest.
What's that?
The eldest.
The eldest? It actually is not established that way. The next Kohen Gadol will be selected among the other Kohanim, and then in the next generation there will be more, presumably, if the birth rate continues as expected, and then more and more and more. So, wouldn't it just be
Who will get the succeeding ones? Who will make the
the other Kohanim, presumably, will make the choice among themselves? And so that's the way you know, as you pointed out. You know who's the Kohen Gadol because he's the one with the fancy ducks.
This is going to lead to a lot of sibling rivalry, I'm afraid.
Sibling rivalry in Judaism.
I know it's startling.
Yeah, couldn't. But we do end up with the question I want to lay out, and we're going to wait until the very end to answer it, but we're going to take a long detour. We're going to end up with this very interesting question, because this is all about appointing a Kohen Gadol and establishing the priesthood as a whole, about having this new high priest office amongst our people. Because who'd been doing the sacrifices up until this point? Moses. Aaron has not been appointed as high priest yet. The Kohanim, the priestly class, has not been established yet. They have not been dressed, and they have not been inaugurated, initiated, I think would be the right word, into the priesthood. So for the moment, Moses is doing all the jobs. He's leading the people both politically and civilly, and he's also leading them in terms of the ritual worship. And he is now transferring that to his brother and his brother's sons.
A question. So then these instructions for the design of these items is meant to be done in the very near future?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
So in the 40 years, they're wearing this.
absolutely, yep.
Appropriate people were.
They didn't wait until they got to the land of Israel to change into their clothes. Very shortly after this parasha, or more specifically, very shortly after the golden calf incident, they go through the inauguration of the Mishkan and the initiation of the priests. And that continues with us for the next 1,000, 1,500 years as an active form of Jewish worship. But the point I wanted to emphasize is that Moses is giving that up. Moses is no longer going to be doing it. And yet, oddly enough, in this whole parasha, uniquely, of all of the Torah, Moses' name is not mentioned. It's the only parasha from the moment Moses is born until the end of Deuteronomy that does not contain the name Moshe. Period. Only in this parasha is his name absent. All right, so we're going to have to take a long detour to figure out how that fits in with the clothing and how it fits in with...
So there's never any comment from Moses asking God, did I displease you? Why are you taking this responsibility away from me?
Not explicitly in the Torah. In the Midrash and among commentaries later, yes. But in the Torah itself, no. God says this is what's going to happen, and Moses doesn't. But Moses is only referred to in a pronoun form in this parasha. You'll take your brother. Not Moses, take your brother. Or not even, and God said to Moses, take your brother. Okay, so we're going to take a real long detour via Shabbat. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit of halakha in the process. And hopefully I'll remember to turn off my ringer before class starts next time. Excuse me for that. Okay, so who wants to pick up with a little reading from our handout? Marion, please.
Why in the only parsha that does not contain Moses' name does Moses appoint his brother and his brother's sons to be priests?
All right, so I want you to hold that as a floating question in your mind and try and believe that I have reasons that are connected to that question for the material that we're going to be studying. Okay, let's get to the first material.
There is no Kiddush except in a place of Sudah, which is feasting.
All right, so we make Kiddush. When do we make Kiddush? When do we make Kiddush? Who didn't come to our mitzvah fair?
Place of Sudah.
No, when do we make Kiddush generally? When we say you make Kiddush, what are we talking about? Friday night?
And Shabbos.
And Saturday morning, or Saturday after services, right? What's that? And festivals and such. But at the moment we're talking about Shabbat Halacha, but it is true for other festivals as well. But there is a Kiddush that we do Friday night, and there is a Kiddush that we do Saturday daytime. All right, so, according to the Halacha, you can only do the Kiddush in a place of Seudah, in a place of feasting. No Seudah, it's not Kiddush. Okay. Okay, you can see the mind's working, but wait a minute, what do we do? Trying to go through, and that's good. So what do we do in our congregation? We eat. Okay, so we eat. Friday night, everybody should be doing Kiddush at home, at their home table, when they have their dinner there. And then in the congregation, we do Kiddush and we have a nosh. We usually have cakes and other things. And then Saturday morning, after services, right, we do Kiddush with the 2 loaves, and then we continue on with additional lovely goodies. Okay, so that's what we do, and I'm going to tell you, we're okay. Not going to suggest that we're changing that, but I want you to understand why we do that. I want you to understand the variety of opinions around why what we do is okay. But sometimes getting underneath the what you do to why you do it, it will hopefully give you a little bit more spiritual insight. So,
The meal establishes the significance of the Kiddush Gionim.
the Gilnim. So, according to the Gilnim, one of the earliest stratas of Jewish commentators, all the way back about 1,200 years ago, their understanding of this halacha as it was quoted later in the Shulchan Aruch, is that it is the meal that makes the cup of wine that you said Kiddush over, Kiddush. What's that?
Then why isn't breakfast?
Then why can't breakfast be Kiddush?
Right.
Well, it depends on what you mean by breakfast. And in fact, there was a very long-standing debate, discussion. I mean, see, I can't even complain. Because mine went off first. About whether or not a person can have breakfast, for example, before Shabbat services.
Let's say you daven.
Okay.
It's a weekday,
Mhm.
daven, you sit down, you make motzi over
Right.
the bread that you're about to eat. Why didn't you make it?
Because there's no mitzvah for Kiddush on a weekday.
It's what separates.
So it's not about the meal, it's about the mitzvah.
Okay, so let's, there's two layers to this. There's the basic layer, which is there's a mitzvah to make Kiddush over a cup of wine. But the question is it that cup of wine in and of itself that makes it Kiddush, or is there something attendant to it that makes it Kiddush? And we're going to get two different set of opinions here. We're going to get two different sets of opinion here. The first set that it's being quoted here is that the reason why that cup of wine counts as Kiddush is because the meal that goes with it makes it more than just a drink that you're having to quench your thirst. That you didn't just drink a cup of wine, but because you have it with a meal, it's now more than that. And finish the paragraph, and maybe we'll have a little bit more to clarify.
This means that the Kiddush
RJM, by the way, is me.
is elevated by the meal and cannot stand alone. Thus, a nice nosh is sufficient as it adds to the Kiddush. Even an extra drink of wine would suffice.
Okay, so this gives a very minimalist interpretation to what it means by there's no Kiddush except in a place of seudah, of feasting. Which means as long as you eat something in addition to the cup of wine, that cup of wine is more than just I'm drinking because I'm thirsty, and therefore becomes suitable for fulfilling the mitzvah of Kiddush. But if you didn't have that meal, and if you just had a small amount of wine, just even if you said the blessings, that wouldn't count as Kiddush. Because it's not enough. It doesn't go along with the seudah, and therefore it is inadequate for the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Kiddush. See that distinction? You got to hold on to that because we're going to flip it on its head in just a second. Because we argue with each other. It's a Jewish thing. Okay, so if we got that idea that the Kiddush is elevated, the cup of wine is elevated high enough by adding something else to it, food or a nosh, or even another drink of wine, to make it significant enough that now you can perform the mitzvah with it. But if you didn't have that extra bit, wouldn't count. You'd just be drinking wine. Even if you said the blessings, you didn't drink a cup of wine significant enough. It wasn't, really done right. Therefore, you couldn't do the mitzvah with it. Be like, trying to fulfill the mitzvah of a talit by wearing a handkerchief. It's just not big enough. Right? You can't just put tzitzit on a handkerchief and throw it over your shoulders and say that's okay. It's got to be a minimum size. It has to be a minimum significance. And wine without a meal is not significant enough.
And this is, I don't know why I'm not doing it. The Seder is a whole different story because the meal is
Exactly.
everything?
Exactly.
Okay.
And not every cup of wine that we
This-
drink at the Seder is a Kiddush.
Okay,
There's only one Kiddush of those 4 cups of wine.
okay.
It's the one where we actually say Mikadesh. All the other ones are just Borei Pri Hagafen, and we're just saying the blessing because we're drinking. And the fact that we're drinking is connected to the Seder, but there's no special blessing for them beyond just I'm drinking. Okay, let's see the opposite opinion.
Kiddush establishes the meal as the second of the 3 seudah of Shabbat. Vilna Gaon and Rav Feinstein.
All right, so Rav Feinstein and Vilna Gaon, 2 more modern but very authoritative rabbinic opinions. say that no. It's not that the food makes the wine significant enough for a kiddush. It is the fact that you're doing kiddush that makes the meal significant enough to count as one of the 3 meals you're supposed to have on Shabbat. Again, unlike we well-fed folks here, in the ancient world, average day, people had 2 meals. Except on Shabbat. On Shabbat, you would have a seudah shlishi. You would have a 3rd meal. And even to this day, we try to squeeze in an extra meal to fulfill that specialness of Shabbat. And to have actually keep reading before why bother explaining it again? It's on the page.
Since all true Seudah of Shabbat use bread,
Seudot is the plural.
this meal also needs bread to say motzi over. If one eats or drinks before this Seudah, you have stepped on part of Shabbat.
Okay, so if Kiddush is coming to establish a meal as a seudah, then that meal needs to be a proper seudah. And officially, a proper seudah needs loaves of bread, it needs challah.
Right. This makes sense. The other one was more difficult to understand. Maybe that's why the Vilna Gaon had to clarify.
Well, but he clarified it in a way that has practical implications. Okay, so between these two opinions, you can end up with a very big difference of opinion in what you actually do, especially in a synagogue, not just in your home. So, for example, many congregations for Friday night will do Kiddush with some cake. According to Vilna Gaon's opinion, you can't do that. Well, you can do that, but that ain't Kiddush. Because cake isn't enough to establish a meal as a formal, technical seudah in the legal definition of the word. What's that? It's just an oneg. Exactly. It's nice. It's an oneg, which means joy, but it's not a seudah. And therefore, you're in a problem. But if you follow the other opinion, the opinion of the Geonim, as long as you're having a little something extra with the wine, that can be Kiddush. Because you're just marking it as something more than quenching your thirst with the fruit of the vine. Again, you got to remember, and maybe in your own home it's true as well, that many people would drink wine for reasons other than Shabbat. And it wasn't only used for religious purposes. It was a common drink. And it wasn't, in many cases, as alcoholic as our current drinks are. So it wasn't like people were walking around drunk all the time. But it would be normal for people to be saying Brei Pri Hagafen all the time when they were drinking wine just because they were drinking wine. So how did you separate it from that? According to the Geonim, you just needed a little bit more. You just needed something a little bit with it to make it good enough. So that's a minimalist view, whereas the Vilna Gaon and Rav Feinstein are looking at it in a more maximalist view. That no, it's not about the cup, it's about what comes after it, and that has to be significant enough to justify drinking at this time.
Using that, would it be adequate if you added the loaves of challah? Would that make it
Absolutely.
more of a meal?
2 loaves of challah, and you've got a meal, even if that's all you've got.
Okay.
Even if you only have 2 loaves of challah, which, by the way, on Shabbat morning is exactly how we do it here.
But then once you have the challah and you make motzi of challah, don't you then have to do birkat after the meal?
Of course. If you've said motzi, you have to do birkat hamazon with.
And maybe that's why we're not doing it on Friday night, because if you made it stretched out that long, you'd have even fewer people.
Well, the bigger issue on Friday night synagogue is that most people are going to have their meal in their home. Whether you be having your meal before you come to shul or whether you're having your meal after you come home from shul, you're going to have your actual Friday night seudah at home. And the Kiddush that we say in the congregation is really meant more for the sake of travelers or people who won't have that option. And so doing it over a full seudah does not seem to be as significant. Okay, so what I want you to sort of take away from this is not necessarily which opinion was right or wrong. They're both very important and very interesting insights into how the interaction of 2 different acts affects the significance of each of them. That there's this synergy, I think is the word of modern buzz speak, between these two acts, where the sum is more than the total of the parts, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So what happens when we take not kiddush and meal, but when we combine kohen and clothing? Who is contributing what in terms of significance to the other? Is it the kohen that, because he's wearing these clothes, makes them holy? Or is it the clothes that make the kohen holy because they were holy and now put on him? Which way is the influence of sanctity transferring? You see that question? Good, Mary and Reed.
Does the high priest wear the clothes because of the job he will do, or because of who he is? That is, the greatest descendant of Aaron in his generation.
Right, which is the object of precedence? Is it, I'm wearing this because I'm doing this function, and doing this function means I wear these clothes? Or it's, I am me, and therefore these clothes are worn by me because that's who they are put upon. Not this is what I wear, but this is who they go to. You see the distinction there? Okay, very good.
Torah has said, and you shall put coats on them, and you shall gird them with girdles, and the priest's office shall be theirs forever.
This is from the next chapter.
That is, when their garments are upon them, their status as priests applies to them. When their garments are not on them, their status as priests does not apply to them, and they are deemed not priests, and a master has said, a non-priest who served at the altar is subject to the death penalty.
Okay, so according to Zvachim in the Talmud, what's the answer to our question?
The clothes make the man.
The clothes make the man, or more specifically, the clothes as a representation of the job that is being fulfilled make the man. And if you're not doing the job, you don't get to go to the mall wearing these garments. And if you did, you'd be in trouble. And vice versa. If you come to the altar not dressed like this, you're just the same as anybody who wasn't a priest if you're not wearing it. Even though your DNA or your lineage or everything about you says Kohen, if you're wearing the wrong uniform or no uniform, you might as well be considered a stranger at the altar. What do we think? Yes? No? Maybe? Reactions?
But if he was not qualified by birth, and he put on the clothes, it still doesn't work.
Okay. But you do need a certain minimum qualification. You can't throw these clothes on just anyone and then call him Mr. Cohen and say that he can serve at the altar. But Mr. Cohen shouldn't think that I get to serve at the altar. It's I, in this capacity, am fulfilling this job. And part of the job is wearing these clothes. It's not attached to me, it's attached to the officiating that I'm doing. But
To extend your analogy,
Mhm.
explain to me where I'm going wrong here.
okay.
If Mr. Cohen,
Why are you assuming you're wrong, first of all?
because it doesn't seem to be what you're saying.
Okay.
If Mr. Cohen goes to the mall without his vestments,
Mm-hmm.
this would seem to be saying to me that he doesn't have to worry about his
Kahuna.
kahunics. Yeah, that is
His kahuna.
his kahuna.
I know, we all have that word from Hawaii now, but it doesn't.
We had it first.
Exactly. Well, I'm not sure we had it first, the Hawaiians are old, but.
Everything, that's right.
You don't stop being a rabbi if you put on shorts and go to the beach. You're a rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
You're not in doing the same things for the same constituency necessarily on the bima,
Right?
but you don't stop being a rabbi.
Correct.
Uh,
You're not going wrong at all, Paula.
oh, okay.
What you're doing is you are butting up against the limits of the midrash that is being used here for application in every sphere of life. So the midrash that's being used here, the way they're trying to read this verse, is trying to teach one lesson, not every lesson.
Oh, very good.
So it's not trying to teach you that if the priest isn't wearing priestly clothes, he can go into a cemetery. Or if the priest isn't wearing priestly clothes, he can marry a divorcee. It's not trying to teach that. It's trying to say, when the priest is officiating, he has to be wearing the clothes because it's not just about him at the altar, it's about the office that he represents. And that office is represented by the clothing. Now, why would the rabbis be so interested, passionate about making sure we could see that distinction? Well, keep reading.
The elders of the court would transfer him to the elders of the priesthood, and they would bring him up to the upper chamber of the house of Alptinus, administer the oath to him, take their leave, and depart. And they would say to him, my master, high priest.
So this is the day before Yom Kippur. They're coming to the high priest, the Kohen Gadol.
We are the messengers of the Beit Din,
Meaning the sages, the Chachamim, the rabbis.
and you are our messenger and the messenger of the Beit Din.
Meaning you are acting on behalf of the Beit Din and of the entire nation when you are about to perform the Yom Kippur service tomorrow.
We make you swear by he who caused his name to dwell in this house that you will not change a thing from what we have told you.
He just got all of his instructions, and at the very end, they're handing him over for the nightly vigil before the next day of Yom Kippur, when he will do all of the major parts of the ceremony. And after they gave him all those instructions and all that training and everything like that, included this is a sheep and this is a cow, they really were that basic in their instructions to him. They then make him swear this oath that he won't do anything different than the rabbis had just told him.
So what you're saying here is that the rabbis don't trust the high priest, who this is his office set by God,
Mhm.
to do the right thing on Yom Kippur.
Correct.
Because by this time, now that we've got rabbis, we've got a bunch of generations past.
Correct.
And our high priests are not so bright. And so the rabbis are going to tell him what to say in the Holy of Holies when he's been appointed by God, and they don't trust him to do it right. So they
Absolutely.
instruct him to remind him, because otherwise he doesn't even know what he's supposed to do.
Absolutely.
Oy vey.
Absolutely. How else would you expect it to happen?
And you rabbis are very important, this is true. Isn't it sort of putting yourself, like, putting themselves high up? But apparently, the high priest must have shown that they were no longer capable.
We'll get
of
there.
fashion.
We'll get there, because the next sentence,
Oh, okay.
He who would separate from them and sob, and they would separate from him and sob.
right, so they give him this oath, they adjure him to that he will not change a single thing of all the instructions he's received, and then they go their separate ways. He to stay there in vigil for the night of Yom Kippur, where he doesn't even get to sleep, and they go their way, and they cry at the parting. Now they're not crying because, oh, I'll see you tomorrow. They're crying because of the state of affairs, that they have to suspect him, that it has come to this, that they can't rely on that he will do it the way they say. Now, why might he do it differently? Ignorance is a possibility, and we'll talk about why ignorance might be a real possibility. But the other is simply because he might be from a different religious sect. He might be a Sadducee, for example, as opposed to one of the Rabbanim, one of the rabbis. And so he might have his own opinion, more specifically about when do you put the incense on the hot coals before you enter the Holy of Holies. Do you put the incense on the hot coals just outside the curtain and then step through? Or do you step through and then put the incense on the hot coals? This was a major point of debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And if you get it wrong, you're the representative of the nation. So we have to make you swear that you'll do it the way the keepers of the law, the sages, say it must be done, not the way your own faction thinks it might be done, because we think you might belong to that faction. We got that distinction happening here? Okay, so if you can't necessarily trust the priests, and if the priests are going to be subject to the laws of other people as well, why have fancy clothes at all?
As an aside, I'm beginning to understand why God allowed the destruction of the temple.
Oh, we're not even done yet. We're not done yet. We got one more text that's going to make you even more convinced of why that might have happened.
Okay, anyway, why the...
But let's get to why have fancy clothes at all?
Make sacral vestments for your brother Aaron for dignity and adornment.
Right, that was the second verse we read today. Have these vestments. Why? For dignity, for adornment? What kind of requirement is that in Judaism? Since when did we say go around and adorn yourself? Since when did we say, put on something beautiful and lovely? I mean, after all, every Friday night when we recite Eshet Chayil from the book of Proverbs, we say,
Strength and majesty are her clothing. She smiles at the future. Charm is deceptive and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears God shall be praised.
who needs fancy clothes? Right? We don't praise, in Eshet Chayil, we don't praise women for being snazzy dressers. We don't say she always makes herself wear the latest designers whose names I can't remember.
Givenchy.
We don't say that. We say she's beautiful without it. It's her strength, her majesty is what she adorns herself. That's the source of her glow, of her beauty. Because beauty and charm, those are all false and deceptive. So why should we pretty up the Kohanim?
I can't.
Especially if they're not pretty inside, if so many of them are suspect.
I can't go any further without bringing this up. By placing the vestments on the high priest, doesn't it take the emphasis off of who he is?
Very good. Hold on to that thought for just one more paragraph. But you're right on target, right on target. Miriam, read the first answer to a question we had way back at the beginning. Remember that? About why Moses' name doesn't appear in this and why Moses is having to appoint his brother and his brother's kids.
As a result of Moses' initial insistence that Aaron lead the Jewish people out of Egypt.
Remember burning bush? Hooray! Don't worry, I'll send Aaron your brother to help you. Well, God may not have said that he was really, really mad at the time, but as a matter of fact, Moses is going to be punished for having initially rejected the offer.
God punished him by removing the priesthood from him and giving the honor to his brother. Moses would now atone for his error by supporting his brother when the priesthood was transferred, just as Aaron had supported his brother when Moses had assumed leadership.
So one reason why Moses doesn't appear in this parashah by name is because the whole point of it is that this is punishment for his initial unwillingness to step forward and lead. So he is being forced to step back and let his brother lead. And part of stepping back is not only handing over the garments and the priesthood to his brother, but is not even getting to appear in the spotlight that is shining on his brother.
But that's contrary to the whole thought of Moses being a humble person. And for God to have chosen him, a humble person would say, who am I that you chose me? There are much better people in this world than me.
The second part is the issue. So in Judaism, humility doesn't mean I won't do it because I'm not good enough. Humility means if I'm capable, I will do it, but I won't think that I'm great because I am. Humility doesn't diminish our own capabilities. It doesn't mean that we refuse to take on the tasks that have been given to us or laid before us just because we don't think we're worthy. If the task has been given to us, we rise to it as best we can. But humility is knowing how far we will rise. And humility means knowing yourself. There's a wonderful line at the end of Masechet Sota in the Talmud where they're going through a list about the death of all the virtues. That when such and such rabbi died, such and such virtue left the world. And they get to the Tana, one of the repeaters of the tradition is saying, when so-and-so died, humility left the world. And one of the later rabbis says, no, that's not true, there's me.
Look who thinks he's humble.
Look who thinks he's humble. But it's a crystal moment in Jewish thinking. Humility doesn't mean I'm not good enough. Humility means I'm this good. Not more and not less. It means knowing yourself and knowing your place in the world. And that doesn't mean you're down. It means you're here. That's humility. That's true humility. True humility doesn't say, oh, no, pick someone else because I'm not good enough. True humility says, I'll do my best, but I know I can only give this much because that's what I am. Not saying, oh, I can do everything. And not saying, I can't do anything. It's, I can do what I can do. That's what humility means in Judaism. So for the end of the Sota, when the guy says, no, humility's not gone, I'm here, he means, no, I have an accurate opinion of what I'm capable of and not capable of. The problem is, of course, in English that the word humility gets all tied up with the idea of being self-effacing and not thinking you can do anything and then retreating from society and responsibility. That's not the Jewish concept of humility.
nor is it the English concept. Humility and humiliation are two very different things.
True.
And yet we want
But we
to
use them
combine the
in,
other.
correct, we use them in casual language that way, and it means,
Equivocal.
what's that?
Very good.
They're equivocal, exactly, exactly. Okay, so that's answer one. Answer two, you're going to find very familiar. Want to read?
The beauty of the clothes of the Kohen Gadol was designed to obscure the identity of the man performing the service. The clothes represented the office, and the officer performed the task, not the man.
So one of the reasons why it was so specific, rather than just letting the Kohen Gadol pick what he wanted as his individual choice. Remember, you had asked Harriet about, well, why didn't they let the individual artisans have more control? Why not have the Kohen Gadol have more control about what he's wearing? Why? For the same reason that you look at the Russian generals and you say, look what happens when they've got control of what they're wearing. That they end up with the fanciest, most elaborate and ridiculous looking uniforms to aggrandize themselves, not to represent what they're doing. But the Kohen Gadol, for as much as they're stepping forward in this parasha, are also being hidden under this burqa of adornment. That means that the individual who's inside that clothing doesn't matter. It's the officer that is officiating that matters, not the person who is that officer. In the same way that for Moses, it wasn't Moses himself that mattered, it was the function that Moses filled as being the most perfect and pure conduit between God and us that has ever lived. And we certainly respect Moses as a person as well, but we had to have at least one parasha where he stepped back and we only see him as a functionary of God's will rather than a man. And that's what he performs in this parasha by not having his name mentioned. And just to finish it off of why we would definitely want to focus on the uniform and not the guy in the uniform, we're going to finish off, and Harriet, why don't you read, because you seemed rather interested in the degradation of the priesthood with the final paragraph.
Said Rabbah Bar Chana, said Rav Yochanan, what is the meaning of the verse of scripture? The fear of the Lord prolongs days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. That's from Proverbs. Fear of the Lord prolongs days. This refers to the first temple, which stood for 410 years, and yet in which served only 18 high priests.
There were only 18 Kohanim Gadol that served in the 420 years of the first temple.
But the
Or 410, sorry.
But the years of the wicked shall be shortened refers to the second sanctuary, which stood for 420 years, and in which more than 300 high priests served. Subtract from the total the 40 years during which Shimeon the righteous served, as well as the 80 years in which Yochanan the high priest served, the 10 in which Ishmael ben Fabi served, and some say 11 that Rabbi Eliezer ben Chason served. Then go and calculate. Each one scarcely lived out his year.
Why? Because at the end of the second temple period, the office of Kohen Gadol was up to the highest bidder. This was a office, like often happens in many cultures, that had become political. And being Kohen Gadol meant that you could steer favors towards your faction of the Kohanic family. Remember, we got a lot of Kohanim now. It meant that you could steer favors towards people you liked, and you could steer them away from people you didn't like. So having the Kohen Gadol be one of yours was very important and very lucrative. And so it went to the highest bidder. It was under the control of Herod the Great at the later time, and under other less righteous kings earlier. And who was the Kohen Gadol was almost certainly, except for these rare occasions, not someone you were likely to want to respect. But you did still respect the function the Kohen Gadol served in the performance of the rituals, not just of Yom Kippur, but in the day-to-day rituals of the temple.
It was the Sanhedrin who was making the selection?
No.
The second temple?
The Sanhedrin did not make the selection. The Sanhedrin were the guys crying because they'd had to give the instructions to this person whose family had bought the office for him.
Who made the selection?
The king. And that was the problem. That was the problem, is that as soon as it became political rather than within, it became corrupt. And even within, there are numerous stories within the Talmud about Kohanim knifing each other over who gets to do which service. So they weren't good at self-regulating either. So the king made it even more corrupt, but there was already the seeds of internal dissension and corruption. And it meant that you had to rely. Who do the rabbis think they are? They thought they were the only people who didn't have a vested interest in what the Kohen Gadol was doing, except for making sure he did it according to Torah and Halakha. And so they had to. But it broke their heart that they had to, because they wished that it weren't so. And so we end up with this situation where you don't always get the perfect person at the top. And in some cases you get pretty far from perfect. But thanks to the way God had created the office of the priesthood, whether the person at the top was perfect or not, Judaism could continue. They were not adorned so much with this, they were imprisoned by the rituals, by the clothing, by the law of Judaism, to try and keep even people who were unfit for serving in this office fit enough to serve in this office, because there wasn't enough wiggle room in the clothes they wore, not literally but figuratively. Make sense?
Could they resign if they decided they didn't like it?
Could they resign? No, usually it was, unfortunately, you only resign by being married. And the great thing is, for one last insight on human psychology, you would think after the first 100 guys died who were unfit, who often didn't make it through Yom Kippur because they were unfit, and standing in the presence of the Holy of Holies and you're unfit, it's not a really good health move. You would think that the 101st guy would say, I'm seeing a pattern here. Maybe I'm not going to let my family appoint me. But everyone thinks, but not me. They went down, but I'll make it, either because I think I'm righteous enough, to go back to our question of humility, or because I think it's superstition, and nothing will really happen. But it kept happening, and everyone kept thinking it wasn't going to happen to them next.
Maybe that's why they had to be instructed by the rabbis, because they hadn't done it before.
Of course, most Kohanim Gadol would not make it through more than one Yom
How
Kippur.
about those 4 that lasted 140 years? They also had to be instructed, even though they've done it 80 times.
I don't think I've read a commentary that goes into that. It's a good question. I mean, certainly they were respected, so they might not have been, but there are also many other places in Jewish law where even somebody who we know is capable, we still instruct them in order that we don't differentiate between those we think are capable and those are not.
I read one place where there was one high priest that served officially under 3 other political high priests.
And who was the backup for all of them.
Yeah.
But in Yoma, the section of Mishnah and Talmud that goes into the regulations for Yom Kippur in particular, it talks about you always appointed a backup high priest, just in case the actual high priest dies. Because you couldn't have Yom Kippur be interrupted by something as inconvenient as someone dropping dead. All right, thank you very much. See you all on Shabbat or next week.